Karen Grassle was the heart of Little House on the Prairie, the calm in the chaos, the mother figure fans adored. But behind the camera, something was very wrong. She never spoke out, not during the show, not for decades after. She kept it to herself, even when it nearly broke her. Now, at 82, she's finally revealing what Michael Landon did to her, and why she stayed silent all those years. For millions of viewers in the 1970s and 80s, Karen Grassle was Caroline Ingalls, the soft-spoken, steady, endlessly compassionate Ma of Little House on the Prairie. She was everything a mother should be, nurturing, graceful, and impossibly patient. And for a time, that's exactly who the world believed Karen Grassle was too. But the truth, as Karen now admits, is far more complicated. She wasn't just acting when she played the long-suffering frontier mother, she was surviving. Surviving the politics of a male-dominated set. Surviving the power plays of one man in particular, Michael Landon. Back then, no one would have guessed. Karen and Michael were the faces of the show, standing shoulder to shoulder in promotional photos, hosting cheerful cast interviews, and delivering performances that made families across America cry each week. Their chemistry on screen was undeniable. But behind the scenes, the balance of power was anything but equal. Michael Landon wasn't just the star of Little House, he was the creator, the writer, the executive producer, and for a time, even the director. He ran the entire operation. And as Karen later shared in her memoir Bright Lights, Prairie Dust, the image of Michael as the benevolent father figure was more myth than reality. She was careful for years. She didn't speak about the tension on set. She didn't contradict the glowing image the public had of Landon. But that silence had a cost. Because while Landon may have played a loving husband on screen, his treatment of Karen off-screen was at times deeply demeaning. In early seasons, Karen was underpaid, drastically, compared to Landon and some of her male counterparts. When she asked for a raise after the show became a hit, Landon's reaction wasn't warm or supportive. He made it clear her request was unwelcome. And according to Karen, that was when things started to shift. Scenes were written differently. Certain emotional moments were cut. Her role was quietly diminished, just enough to make a point, just enough to remind her who had the power. She was humiliated, not in front of cameras, but behind them, in script meetings, on set, through jokes that crossed the line and comments that made her feel small. Karen says Michael would make vulgar remarks even during filming of intimate scenes, crude, unnecessary lines delivered with a smirk, as if to say, "You want more. This is what more looks like." And yet, she didn't walk away. Because like so many women in Hollywood at the time, Karen had learned to endure, to stay silent, to pick her battles. She knew how hard she'd worked to land that role. She knew what the show meant to people, and how rare it was to be a woman over 30 holding her own on a primetime drama. So she smiled. She showed up. She delivered lines. And she kept the rest locked away, for decades. Only now, at 82, is she ready to speak. Not for revenge. Not to ruin a legacy. But because the truth matters. Because telling her story means finally letting go of the burden she carried quietly for too long. And what she's about to share next is even more disturbing. When Little House on the Prairie first aired in 1974, Karen Grassle thought she had landed a dream job. The scripts were warm. The set was friendly. And Michael Landon, already famous from Bonanza, seemed charming, funny, and fiercely committed to making the show a success. But Karen wasn't naive. She understood from the beginning that this was his world. He was more than just the star. He had creative control, editorial say, and the final word on everything, from storylines to casting. For the first few seasons, that imbalance of power didn't cause open conflict, but it lingered like a shadow. And then it reared its head. As the show found its rhythm and gained massive popularity, Karen's role as Ma became central to its emotional foundation. Fans loved her. The network noticed her. Ratings soared. But one thing didn't change: her paycheck. While Landon was securing massive contracts and production perks, Karen remained stuck in her original agreement, far below what she knew she was worth. And when she finally pushed back, asking for a raise, the consequences were swift. Michael didn't yell. He didn't threaten. Instead, he did something quieter and crueler. According to Karen, he used the script. Suddenly, scenes were restructured. Caroline's speeches were shortened. Family dinners, once tender and emotional, were turned into fleeting moments. And perhaps most tellingly, Landon's character began to dominate the emotional arc of the episodes, while Karen's character drifted into the background. It wasn't subtle. And it wasn't an accident. Karen later said she felt like she was being punished for speaking up. For daring to negotiate. For forgetting that her place on that set was not just as a co-star, but as a subordinate. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was playing a mother who held a family together through hardship, while quietly enduring humiliation in real life. And it didn't end with the script. Behind the scenes, Landon's humor began to shift. What once felt like playful teasing turned into targeted jabs. Karen has said that he would make crude jokes in front of the crew, particularly during scenes where she had to be physically close to him. During one memorable filming day, while prepping for a romantic moment between Charles and Caroline, Landon reportedly cracked a joke about her body loud enough for the room to hear. People laughed. Karen didn't. She smiled. She acted. She kept going. Because what was the alternative? To complain? To walk away from the most high-profile job she'd ever had? Karen had trained for years as a serious actress. She'd done Shakespeare, theatre, drama. This role had given her national recognition. And she feared that calling out Landon, the show's beloved patriarch, would make her look like the villain. And that's the part that haunted her for years. It wasn't just the hurtful comments. It wasn't just the unequal pay. It was the fact that she had to swallow it all and pretend it didn't matter. That every time she stood next to Landon in an interview and called him wonderful, she was betraying herself. It's no wonder she stayed silent. Speaking out back then would have meant career suicide. She was up against a man adored by viewers, protected by producers, and quite frankly, too powerful to challenge. So she waited, quietly, carefully, until one day, long after the cameras stopped rolling and long after Michael Landon was gone, she decided to speak. And what she revealed next shocked even those who thought they knew the whole story. For years, Karen Grassle avoided interviews. She skipped reunions. She stayed away from headlines that painted Little House on the Prairie as the perfect show with a perfect cast. But when she turned 80, something changed. She began to write. It wasn't supposed to be a takedown. Her memoir Bright Lights, Prairie Dust was meant to explore her life in full, her childhood, her struggles, her rise to fame, and the complicated layers that fame brought with it. But as the pages came together, Karen realized there was one truth she couldn't keep avoiding, the way Michael Landon had treated her, and how deeply it had wounded her. She'd buried it for decades. At first, she told herself it wasn't worth revisiting. Then, over time, she convinced herself that maybe it hadn't been that bad. But as she started writing, the memories came back vividly, especially the one that finally pushed her to speak. It was during a heated contract negotiation. Karen had mustered the courage to demand what she deserved, equal pay, or at least something closer to it. She wasn't asking to match Landon's millions, just a raise that reflected her role and popularity. And what happened next was chilling. Karen claims that right after the failed negotiation, something changed in their scenes together. It was subtle but unmistakable. During one emotional on-screen kiss between Charles and Caroline, Landon reportedly changed the tone of the scene, leaning in for the kiss in a way that felt performative, exaggerated, and completely different from how they rehearsed it. To Karen, it was a message, you're replaceable. A warning. And it worked. She didn't bring it up to producers. She didn't complain to the crew. Because she knew the system wouldn't protect her. It never had. Her memoir describes that moment as one of the lowest of her professional life, not because of the kiss itself, but because of the shame that came with realizing she had no recourse, no power, no safety net. Just a smile and a script. Even more disturbing were the stories that followed. Karen recalled how Landon, despite being married at the time, would openly flirt with women on set, sometimes even in front of their children. He joked about women's bodies, their voices, their clothes. And because he was the boss, no one pushed back. Karen saw it all and stayed quiet. She'd learned early on that speaking up meant being labeled difficult, a reputation no actress wanted in the 70s, especially not one nearing 40. But silence has a weight, and over the years, Karen carried that weight into every audition, every interview, every public appearance. Writing the memoir forced her to confront it, to see just how much she had endured and how little credit she had ever given herself for surviving it. And when the book came out, something surprising happened. Readers believed her. Fans supported her. And people who had never questioned Michael Landon's reputation began to see the cracks in the legend. For Karen, it wasn't about revenge, it was about truth and healing. She didn't set out to destroy anyone's memory, but she also wasn't going to keep protecting someone who had made her feel so small for so long. The truth, she said, had waited long enough. But what many didn't realize is that Karen wasn't done yet, because there was one moment, one letter, that changed everything before Michael Landon's death. And that's where her story takes an unexpected turn. By the late 1980s, Little House on the Prairie had been off the air for several years. The cast had gone their separate ways, and the world had moved on. But for Karen Grassle, the memories remained unresolved, unspoken, and unfinished. And then came the news that stopped her in her tracks: Michael Landon had cancer. A rare, aggressive form, and the prognosis wasn't good. For most people who knew Karen's story, the assumption would be simple, that she'd feel vindicated, maybe even relieved to see the man who'd wronged her brought low by life itself. But Karen felt something very different. She felt sadness. Because no matter what had happened between them, Michael had been a part of her life, deeply, permanently. They had spent almost a decade together on set. They had cried in scenes, laughed between takes, and built something that still meant the world to millions of viewers. And now he was dying. Karen wrestled with what to do. Part of her wanted to remain silent, just as she always had. But another part, the part that had quietly mourned the loss of a friendship that never quite was, knew this was her last chance. So she wrote him a letter. Not a scolding. Not an attack. But a letter of peace. In her memoir, Karen describes the moment with astonishing clarity. She sat alone at her kitchen table, pen in hand, unsure what she even wanted to say. The words didn't come easily. How do you address a man who had once humiliated you, and yet shared so much of your life? But eventually, she found the words. She thanked him for the opportunity, for believing in her enough to cast her, for giving her the platform to reach millions of homes, even if the cost was silence. And she told him she forgave him. She didn't list every offense. She didn't rehash every insult. Instead, she wrote from a place of closure, a place that had taken her decades to reach. The letter was mailed, and Karen waited. She didn't expect a reply. She wasn't even sure if Michael would read it. But then, not long after, she heard from someone in his circle. Michael had read her letter, and he'd cried. It was one of the final pieces of communication he received before his passing. For Karen, it was enough. It didn't erase what happened. It didn't rewrite history. But it did give her something she never thought she'd have, a sense of peace. She carried that moment quietly for years, never shared it publicly, never used it to burnish her reputation or stir drama. Until her memoir. And even then, she presented it gently, deliberately. Because she knew the Michael Landon that fans adored still lived in their memories. She didn't want to destroy that. She just wanted to add a footnote. A truth. Her truth. The truth that even the most beloved stars have flaws. That even the strongest women carry scars. That even a letter written in silence can heal a lifetime of pain. But what came after the memoir's release stunned even Karen. Because the reaction wasn't just sympathy. It was shock, outrage, and a long overdue reckoning with the legacy of one of television's most untouchable figures. And that reaction would soon pull in others, former cast members who for years had remained just as silent as she had. When Karen Grassle's memoir hit shelves, it landed like a quiet thunderclap. There were no screaming headlines. No press tours full of scandal. Just the steady release of a story that had waited over 40 years to be told. But the shockwaves were immediate. Fans of Little House on the Prairie, many of whom had grown up idolizing Michael Landon, felt betrayed, not by Karen, but by the realization that their childhood hero may have created a culture of fear and disrespect behind the scenes. People had watched him play the perfect father week after week, never questioning the reality beneath the image. And suddenly the questions started piling up. Because Karen wasn't the only one who had stayed quiet. In the months following the book's release, several former cast and crew members began to speak, some publicly, others in private interviews. And while not all of them shared Karen's exact experience, a pattern began to emerge. Stories of a set that wasn't as wholesome as it looked. A few admitted they'd always felt the tension between Karen and Michael but didn't dare interfere. Others recalled Landon's sharp temper when things didn't go his way, and his tendency to use humor as a weapon. Crude jokes weren't uncommon, and neither was the occasional public dressing down of anyone who challenged him, especially women. Even Melissa Gilbert, the show's beloved Laura Ingalls, had previously hinted at the contradictions in Michael's character. She adored him, still does by all accounts, but she has never denied that Landon could be emotionally manipulative, especially when his authority was questioned. The difference was, Karen Grassle was the first to document it. To stand alone. Name it clearly. And publish it for the world to see. And for that, she received a mix of admiration and criticism. Some accused her of trying to tarnish a dead man's legacy. Others claimed she was bitter, jealous, or seeking attention. But those who understood the era. She worked in the power dynamics of 1970s Hollywood, knew better, because Karen's story wasn't just about Michael Landon. It was about an entire system that allowed charismatic men to run the show unchecked. A system where the women who spoke up were dismissed while the men who crossed lines were celebrated. A system where actresses had to smile through slights, swallow insults, and pretend it was all just part of the job. And Karen Grassle had lived it all. She never said Landon was evil. In fact, she was careful to describe him as a man of contradictions, funny and generous one moment, cold and retaliatory the next. She gave him credit where it was due. She acknowledged his talent, his charm, even his kindness when it suited him. But she didn't sugarcoat the rest. Not anymore. And that honesty opened the door for others, not just in Hollywood, but across industries and generations. Women who had kept quiet for years began to share their own stories, inspired by someone who waited until she had nothing left to prove and then spoke from the heart. In many ways, Karen Grassle's memoir did more than just tell a story. It started a conversation about what we protect in our heroes and what we're finally willing to confront. And for those who still saw Michael Landon as the untouchable icon of television's golden age, Karen's revelations forced one final question: if the power we loved on screen wasn't who he claimed to be, then what other truths have we ignored? By the time Karen Grassle reached her 80s, most of her peers had long since faded into quiet retirement. The era of Little House on the Prairie had passed. Michael Landon was gone. The fans had grown older and the press had mostly moved on. But something in Karen hadn't rested. She had been praised for decades as the graceful, elegant, steady presence on the show, but not many had stopped to ask what it cost her to play that role, not just on screen, but in real life. After her memoir's release, the interviews slowly began to follow. But Karen didn't chase attention. When she did speak, it was with the same quiet dignity that made her so beloved as Caroline. She didn't scream her story. She spoke it carefully, thoughtfully, with restraint and grace. And in doing so, she reframed her own legacy. She was no longer just the actress who played Ma. She became a symbol for a generation of women who had stayed silent in the face of power, and who were finally finding the strength to speak. The irony, of course, is that Karen Grassle never wanted to be the center of controversy. For years, she turned down opportunities to share her truth. She let Michael Landon's legacy flourish, even when she knew the full story. And when people asked her about him in interviews, she stuck to the script: he was wonderful, he was talented, he made us laugh. All of which, in its own way, was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. And that's what finally drove her to speak, not to cancel, not to shame, but to complete the picture. to add her voice to a story that had always been told through someone else's lens. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted accuracy. And in the process, she gave fans something deeper than nostalgia. She gave them honesty. Michael Landon remains a complex figure in television history, brilliant, magnetic, ambitious, and flawed. Very flawed. Karen Grassle didn't erase his memory. She expanded it. She forced the public to hold both truths at once, that he was a visionary and that he could also be cruel. And she didn't stop there. Karen used the momentum of her memoir to support causes close to her heart, including mental health support for women in the entertainment industry and advocacy for fair treatment on sets. She made appearances not as a victim but as a survivor, not as a bitter actress, but as a woman who had lived through something painful and come out stronger for it. Her story isn't a cautionary tale. It's a call for accountability. A reminder that silence may be survival, but truth is liberation. Karen Grassle stayed silent for decades. She smiled when she was expected to. She showed up, performed, and never let the world see her break. But behind that calm, iconic face was a woman carrying the weight of disrespect, imbalance, and humiliation. Now, at 82, she's no longer protecting the myth. She's reclaiming her truth. And fans, many of whom once adored Michael Landon without question, are finally seeing the story in full. Because sometimes, the strongest voices are the ones that waited the longest to speak. If the story stayed with you, the next one will stay with you even longer. Watch it now.